Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 2 game from the World Open. Now, if you followed the round 1 video, you know that I won a nice game with White in the Grunfeld playing down, and as is the case with the Open tournament, you usually have to play a few rounds down before you play the top guns. And so I was playing down again with Black this time against another lower rated player. This individual was named Andrew Ardito and was actually 2100 FIDE. So even though he was untitled, he was actually quite a bit stronger than my round 1 opponent. And I was also Black, so it would be a tough test. Anyways, let's get into it. So Andrew opened with E4, and I played C6, going to the Caro-Kann, and D4, D5, and Knight C3 was played in. Knight C3 is typically one of the main lines in the system. The other main line is to play E5 and go for the advanced variation. But after Knight C3, I get a choice. I can either, well, first of all, you take on E4 pretty much against anything, which is what I did after D takes E4, Knight takes E4. And typically here, there's 3 different moves that you can play. One is the most popular. It's the classical old main line, and it's bishop f5, developing the bishop there, challenging the knight on e4. And there's a ton of theory here. Typically, knight g3 is played, and after bishop g6, normally there's a hunt of this bishop on g6. H5, note it traps the bishop, and so normally they go h6 here. And then h5, bishop h7, bishop d3, takes, knight f3, knight d7, knight f3, e6. This is typically one of the main lines in the Caro-Kann. And a lot of times here, the first new move happens on close to move 20 because a position like this has actually been played a million times before. And obviously I'm exaggerating when I say a million, but this type of position has been played hundreds of times, and just as a fairly well-known position in this line. And because of that, there's not a lot of room for creativity early on because so much is so known there. But that's one line, is to play the classical Caro-Kann, and it has a good reputation. Black is not struggling there. Another line is knight d7, and this is actually known as the Karpov variation, because Karpov actually played this, he was the biggest proponent of this when he was, during his reign as world champion in the 80s. Well, I don't know if and also the 90s. He basically played this for a long time. But right now, the move knight g5 has actually challenged the black player quite a bit. The point is that if you go h6 trying to challenge this knight, there's actually knight e6, and you can't recapture because of queen h5 mate. And so there's actually a lot of attacking chances here for white with the move knight g5 and then bishop d3. And some of the lines here go like knight g5, knight f6 typically. Now h6 is a threat because the knight is actually covering the h5 square. But then bishop d3 is played, and the point is now h6 again is not so advisable because after h6, now knight e6 is renewed because now instead of queen h5 as the move, there's actually bishop g6 mate. So after f takes e6, bishop g6, well, that's a mate and that's a problem there. And then typically because of that, after bishop d3, black has to go e6. And this isn't necessarily in the spirit of a Caro-Kann position because the bishop on c8 actually doesn't get outside the pawn chain like it normally does in Caro-Kanns, although black has a reasonably solid position. The game normally goes queen e2, bishop d6. Note that the famous well, let me show what normally happens. Queen e2, bishop d6, knight f3, and then h6, and then knight e4, takes, queen c7, castles, b6, and actually the main line here is actually after queen g4 to play king f8. And the idea is actually you put this bishop on b7 and you have your bishops lined up like this, and you try to play c5 and get counterplay that way. And I don't know, this position is also playable for black and has a decent theoretical reputation, but you can see the rooks aren't connected and won't be for some time, and the king on f8 is a little bit awkward, and white has reasonable attacking chances here based upon those factors. Actually, I just want to point out that in the Kasparov Deep Blue match in the 90s, the really famous the really famous final game against Deep Blue where Kasparov lost the match. He played h6 here instead of bishop d6. Well, before bishop d6, and essentially this move is actually losing by force, or because of the move knight takes e6. And the problem is this piece sacrifice after f takes e6, bishop g6 check, king e7 is just really, really bad for black, because the rook and bishop are pretty much in jail here. The bishop on g6 is really great, and the king is permanently exposed. And there's a lot of history behind what happened in that match in this specific game. Kasparov alleges that Grandmasters actually inserted this line into the computer the night before their game, and that the reason he was going for this line is because the computer didn't actually see the sacrifice on its own. And there's a whole controversy behind it. But anyways, the point is that, this is the Karpov variation. And so there's one other variation. It's actually the one I played, and it's knight f6. And this line is actually after knight takes f6, which was played, and e takes f6, which I played, is known as the Tartakower variation. And this line actually I used in January, I believe, at the Bay Area International when I first started doing the Road to Grandmaster series. So it must have been in the first group of 10, essentially. I think I played it against the FM at that tournament and got a draw. And essentially with the system, the idea that, black is actually arguing for is, even though his structure is, deficient, he has these double pawns, the f6 pawn in particular does a good job of covering the e5 square so that the knight doesn't have a nice outpost in the middle, and additionally gives extra protection to the king on g8. And so in the short term, in the opening and the middle game, black's king is relatively secure and he has easy and open development for his pieces. But in the long term, if white is able to trade all the pieces theoretically and get to an endgame with just pawns, white would actually be winning, because he has a 4 versus 3 on the king side and actually can create a passed pawn. And I can't create a passed pawn with my 4 versus 3 on the king side. So basically, that's the sort of theme of the structure, and it has a relatively solid reputation, and I tend to like the structure just because it's very difficult for white to actually directly attack black in this position. But again, it's a tough one to try and win because of the pawn structure. So that was actually the challenge in this game. So anyways, after e takes f6, knight f3 was played. This is one of the main moves in this position. The other plan in the position is actually to go c3, and this was actually played at the Bay Area International when I played this early in the year. Essentially, my opponent went for bishop d3 and queen c2, and the idea is you get a quick battery against the h7 pawn. So, for instance, if c3, bishop d6, bishop d3, castles, queen c2, already h7 is attacked with tempo, and after rook e8 check, the knight, instead of going to f3, goes to e2. And the argument here is that this pressure is pretty annoying on the h-pawn, and if you go g6 to try and shut down that diagonal, white will now go h4 and get a pretty nice initiative going on the king side. Of late in this position, in the past year or so, it's been all the rage here to actually go h5 and push this h-pawn up the board. And the idea is, if black castles, you actually go h4 and you try to take space on the king side with the h-pawn. I don't know how I feel about this. I think it's certainly playable, and black is not doing too terribly here, but I'm a little suspicious of the setup in general. I'm not so sure that this is, that black is doing so well here, because it seems to me this pawn could be more of a weakness than a strength down the road. And, of course, white still has this nice structure. So, yeah, so that's actually a really viable alternative, and it's a tough one to face. But in this game, my opponent went knight f3. So anyways, after knight f3, I went bishop d6 and bishop d3, and I castled. And now you can see one of the drawbacks of this structure is that there isn't the sort of battery on h7 right away, so I don't have to really worry about that. White now went bishop e3. I'm not so sure I love this move. I think I think there are two problems with it. One, on e3, it's kind of like a fat pawn. It doesn't have any scope on this diagonal. It's not particularly active. And the other issue I have with it is that, it actually blocks the half-open e-file for the rook that might, want to land on e1 one day. So I'm not a huge fan of bishop e3, although it's playable. And maybe he was keeping his options open. Maybe he's trying to go queen d2 and castles queenside. But again, I just don't feel the bishop on e3 is well placed. But that's one of the advantages of white going bishop d6 really quickly, is that this bishop here actually controls the one really active diagonal. And so typically the dark square bishop of white has a problem getting activated, because you could see g5 is covered by the black pawn on f6. So anyways, after bishop e3, I went knight a6. And this move, if you haven't seen it before, might seem a little bit unusual and weird, because you're like, when you're learning chess, it's like, well, aren't knights on the rim dim or grim or bad or whatever? Well, the thing about this knight on a6 is it's not going to be here for long, and it can relocate to two very, very decent squares. One is b4, not b5, b4, where from here it challenges the bishop on d3, and which is very annoying. And the other route is actually c7 to d5, where it can actually potentially challenge the bishop on e3. So the knight is not very bad here at all. The other thing is, after bishop takes a6, you might say, well, doesn't, black ruin his pawn structure here? Well, actually, I can actually play the move queen a5 check in this position. And note that now I can pick up the bishop with my queen after a move like c3 and not ruin my pawn structure, and temporarily prevent white from castling kingside. But even if I didn't have that check in the game, actually, knight a6, bishop takes a6, even b takes a6 wouldn't be bad for black, because even though these pawns are doubled, black now has secured the two bishops, which are a huge asset. And also the half-open b file could be a source of counterplay for black. So even though these pawns look kind of mangled, it's actually a fine position for black. Black is actually not worse here. So yeah, so knight a6 is actually quite playable. After knight a6, c3 was played, which is extremely logical. You want to take away the b4 square from this knight. An alternative is a3, kind of doing the same thing of stopping knight b4. But, after knight a6, I get a, nice tempo, because you have to stop knight b4. And now I go knight c7, and you can see how this knight is already rerouting itself towards the center, where it's going to be really, really well placed. After knight c7, knight h4 is played, and this move I think is a little bit suspicious, because it's breaking a rule. First of all, you're moving the same piece in the opening, and you can say, well, maybe you moved the same piece in the opening with your knight, but the point is I'm castled already. So I can take such liberties because my king is already secure. White's king, on the other hand, is still on e1, and so it doesn't make sense for this knight to just be hopping around, because you're going to have to, do something about the king on e1 anyway. And as I always say, you do what you have to do so you can do what you want to do. And so you're going to have to resolve the king on e1, so you take care of that before you, deal with any fancy knight maneuvers. Now, knight h4 does have a concrete idea, trying to get to f5. And on f5, it would be kind of an annoying outpost, because it's hard to evict with g6. It might jump to h6. And it also hits this dark square bishop on d6, which is something I don't want to give up. In this type of position, where I already have a structural disadvantage, I really want to make sure that I keep the right pieces on the board. And so losing a bishop for a knight would make my position really perilous, because I already have a structural deficiency. So I really don't want to trade bishop for knight. And I was trying to remain alert to that. Now, because I was so wary of this knight f5 idea, I actually played g6, which I thought was a good bit of prophylaxis, just stopping knight f5, and in some lines also cutting off the bishop on this diagonal, so that a move like queen c2 doesn't come with tempo, hitting my pawn on h7. But it actually turns out I had a better move here instead of g6, and it was the move knight d5. And the point is, knight f5 is actually not really a problem for me right now, because, again, white isn't castled. So it's actually more important that you deal with, this king. And If you play a move like queen h5, which is something I was kind of worried about, I thought there might be potential sacrifices on g6, and that's kind of why I rejected this. I can actually play g6 anyway, and the point is, after a move like knight takes g6, f takes g6, and bishop takes g6, I don't have to actually take the second piece. I can actually just go queen e7 and cover the h7 square, and so yeah, it's just a totally fine position for black, and yeah, it's just black is just winning. This is just a winning position because there's no checkmate on h7. So yeah, so queen h5 is not an issue. Knight d5 also eyes the e3 bishop, and yeah, this just is not a good position for white. Note that if you try to play knight f5 now, I can actually take on f5, and after bishop takes f5, just go rook e8. And the issue here is that I'm actually ganging up on the e3 bishop, and I'm going to win a pawn. And you might say, well, isn't it opposite colored bishops? Isn't this just a draw? Well, the thing is with heavy pieces on the board and my king being way more secure than white's, this is actually going to be a very bad position for white. So let's say castles is played. Now I have the move g6 first, kicking this bishop out, protecting this diagonal. And if once the bishop retreats, now I can make a move like knight takes e3. And after f takes e3, rook takes e3, you see I'm a pawn up, first of all, and this king side is very, very airy, with only 2 pawns here, where my king side with 4 pawns is massively secure. And actually the presence of opposite-colored bishops actually give me massive attacking chances because white can't actually oppose my dark square bishop anyway, whereas this bishop on d3 is totally blocked out by my pawns. So again, not all hardly actually are opposite colored bishop positions drawn unless it's actually a very, very simplified ending with no other pieces on the board. So just be aware of that, because I feel like when you're starting out, you're not actually aware of this, and you tend to lose your sense of danger in positions with opposite colored bishops. Anyways, so knight d5 was better. Instead, I went g6. And now white played queen f3. And again, this move is very suspicious to me. I think it's interesting from the standpoint it is eyeing f6. But again, you do what you have to do, so you do what you want to do. And, castling was probably better. After queen f3, now I went knight d5. And it's still a good move, but it's just a little bit late. After knight d5, castles was played. So finally he castled. And here was actually another critical position for me, because the question is, how do I proceed here? Note that my knight is now on d5 and is really nice and active, but it's also eyeing this bishop on e3, and I was thinking, do I want to trade this knight for this bishop? This knight is so good, but bishops are better than knights, and getting the bishop pair was nice. But the other thing I was thinking about is that after knight takes e3, surely he'd take with the f pawn, and then the rook might be active on the f file. And I was thinking, well, I'm strengthening his center, and the rook gets active on the f file. Is that actually something I want? I don't know. And so I thought for a while, and because I wasn't quite sure, I actually about taking on e3, I actually decided to keep the tension a little bit longer and played the move f5. Now, f5 is actually a decent move because I'm actually hitting the knight on h4, and that was the idea, is I'm hitting this knight on h4, I'm indirectly protecting the f pawn, because if I took on e3 right away, after e3, my f pawn would be attacked, and now it's actually not. So I played f5 first, just to keep my options open, attack this knight, and now I might take next move. But it actually turns out I had a much, much stronger move in this position instead of f5 that is an amazing, amazing resource and kind of counterintuitive, but just works tactically. And the move is actually h5. And h5 at first sight looks extremely puzzling because it looks like you're just weakening the g6 pawn. It's almost like you're inviting sacrifices on g6. But the actual idea with h5 is that I'm threatening to trap the queen with bishop g4 amazingly. So let's say a move like rook a e1 is played. Now bishop g4, queen e4, and f5, and the queen is just completely trapped because all of the squares on these diagonals are cut off by my bishops. So really, really tough spot for white after h5. And actually, white's pretty much obliged to play h3 to cover the g4 square. But now I can play f5, and it's a huge difference now because now this knight on h4 is really lacking squares. And, if you try to sacrifice, I can easily parry the sacrifice by just giving up my rook for this bishop. And I have 2 pieces for the rook and a really active bishops and a nice knight on d5. This position is actually totally winning. And the issue is there's no really effective way after f5 to defend this knight on h4 anymore because the squares here are taken by my bishop. And if you go g3, ooh, that's very, very awkward at the very least because I have this move f4, which challenges this bishop on e3, attacks the h3 pawn, and of course you can't take because the h4 knight is hanging. So very, very strange that this move queen f3 is actually exposed on that square because of this h5 move, and all of a sudden black would be very, very close to winning, in fact. Yeah, h5 was kind of a missed opportunity. It's already -1 in this position. I play h5. Instead, I played f5, and after f5, white played g3, and the difference in this line is that now my bishop on c8 is cut off on this diagonal, so my bishop actually doesn't get active, and that's kind of the difference. I could have had it active, and now it's not. So after g3, I thought, okay, I should try and take this this bishop on e3 because I thought if I didn't, white may consider bishop h6 and knight g2 and start to play on the dark squares in my camp. So I decided to take that bishop, knight takes e3, and after f takes e3 was played, I played bishop e6. And my rationale here was, okay, I obviously missed that tactic before, but I still have the bishop pair, and I thought my pawn structure here, the double pawns here, were actually really promising because note that g4 is really out of the question because of my f pawn and f5. And if you play e4, you do open the position a little bit for your bishop on d3 and maybe the rook coming to the e file, but you actually undouble my pawns. And so, the structural deficit that I typically have in this position would be no more. So I thought, now actually I get quite a promising position here because I have the 2 bishops and my pawn structure is not bad, and this e3 pawn is a potential target. So I felt pretty good here. After bishop e6, white played knight g2, and I thought this was a logical move, rerouting this knight that was doing absolutely nothing on h4 and putting it on f4 where it can eye my e6 bishop. And here I played queen b6. And you might say this is a little bit puzzling, moving your queen away from the king side, but I thought it was important to get some counterplay on the b2 pawn. I wanted to soften up his pawn structure. Like if he plays a move like b3, I thought maybe c3 is now sensitive, and I might consider a move like queen a5 and target c3 even. And then the rook on a1 might be held up a little bit because the a2 pawn might be hanging. So I thought queen b6 is a way to soften up the queen side a little bit. And after rook f2 was played, I think that was a good move, not weakening the pawn structure at all. Now I went rook a e8, and my idea was to just centralize my rooks, get my rooks connected, and kind of play on the king side. Now, a better move than rook a e8 would have actually been bishop d5, and the point is I actually challenged the queen on f3 right away, and I kind of encroach on its space. Of course, if the queen goes back, now I can go rook a e8, and you can see that the difference is this e3 pawn is very weak and backward, and I can just double on the file and, probably win that pawn. So the move here would have to be e4 for white, but now I can actually take on e4 a few times and go rook a e8 now. And the point is that I'm actually ever so slightly better in this position because I can play rook e7 and consider doubling my rooks, but I also have the idea of playing c5 and opening up this diagonal against the king on g1, and tactically there might be some themes here. For instance, if rook a8, queen f3, c5, you obviously can't take because bishop takes and you're losing in exchange. And if you go d5 to try and shut the diagonal down, I might consider c4. And all of a sudden, this pawn on d5 might be a little bit of a target. And bishop c5 is still a threat, renewing that threat. And, yeah, you're just hassling, white just enough before he's able to get counterplay on the f-file. So, slightly better way of playing would have been this bishop d5 move. Instead, after rook a8, white played knight f4, and here you can see now I don't have bishop d5 anymore as a possibility because, it would just be hanging. But I saw this, and I thought that I still had a promising position here by just actually taking on f4. And my idea was that even though I'm giving up the bishop pair here, I thought by having my bishop on this diagonal, my bishop was actually better than the one on d3 because this one is biting on my wall of pawns, whereas I thought this one might activate on d5. So after bishop takes f4, queen takes f4, I considered maybe going bishop d5 at some point and having my bishop be really strong here because on e4 it kind of block out the white pieces. Now the reason I can't go bishop d5 right away, which is what I want to do, is actually because of a little tactic that forces a draw. Bishop takes f5 unfortunately would force a repetition because if I recapture now, there's just queen g5 check, king h4, queen f6 check, king g8, and I can't get out of the repetition. And of course, playing someone that's like 300 points lower rated than me, I didn't want to draw here. So I wanted to avoid that. And so because of that, I started with the move c5. And my idea here was now I'm actually maybe causing a little bit of a crisis in the center for white's pawns. But also, my queen is now defending the g-file horizontally. So my next move is actually bishop d5 because now the sacrifice I can block the check with moving the queen to g6. So a little bit of a nuance there, multi-purpose move with c5. The other idea with c5 was to try and seize space with c4 and continue to kind of choke out the bishop on d3. White probably should have played c4 himself to just stop the c4 idea. Black is actually not worse here, but white has a playable position. Note now this pawn might come to d5 and he might have a protected passed pawn, but the nature of the structure with this weak e3 pawn and my rook having play on the e-file means that black is fine. After c4 I could go f6, and if d5, bishop d7, and this d-pawn is pretty well blockaded, and I can continue with rook e5 and rook fe8 and put a lot of pressure on the e3 pawn, and black is pretty much okay. In fact, I'd prefer black because if I played rook e5 and queen d6, I effectively blockade white's pawns on the dark squares. So, yeah, it seems pretty fine for black, but c4 would have been a better move. Instead, white played queen h6. I think in some ways trying to entertain, maybe swing this rook over with rook h4, maybe thinking about these sacrifices, but they don't quite work anymore because my queen, again, is staying connected to the g6 pawn. And so here I pressed forward with c4, and I thought the squeeze was on because now after the bishop moves away to f1, I went bishop d5, and now the e3 pawn is fixed as a weakness. My bishop has a lovely diagonal pointing towards the king, and you can see my queen, just the hero right now, defending horizontally, so that now rook takes f5 doesn't work as a tactic trying to pry open with the perpetual on g5. So, yeah, I thought black was actually a great deal better here, and I thought, honestly, that I was going to go on to win the game in, a nice positional squeeze. White now went rook ae1, covering the e3 pawn, and that's actually the other issue with the setup now, is that if you try to go rook f4, and for this checkmate, I actually can just go queen e6, and the point is now the e3 pawn is a target, so he has to defend that, because if you go rook h4, I could take with check. Although even better than queen e6 probably is just going, rook e7. And the point is that now I'm actually not rook e7, excuse me, f6. And the point is now if rook h4, I can go rook f7. And in this position before rook f7, my rook is actually hitting e3, and the queen is hitting b6. And so tough to defend both of those. So really I think, black is in really good shape here. And after bishop d5, rook e1, I took a step in the wrong direction. Now, black is actually very, very close to winning, and I should just keep the pressure on the e-file with the move rook e6. The point is that if white tries to swing the rook over with rook f4, I can actually take on b2, sort of paradoxically. And the point is that after rook h4, I can just go rook f8 and give up the h7 pawn because black's is actually taking the whole queen side, and this is just a pawn. And it turns out that after queen takes h7 check, king f8, my king is more than safe, and I can just run to the king side if need be, and in the mean side just collect these pawns. Now, the human in me was thinking, well, I don't really want to allow queen takes h7. That might be really dangerous, so I should defend it. And that's why I actually played queen c6, because I just was waiting a little bit longer, kind of trying to hold up rook f4 with rook e4 and just trying to hold up that initiative. But queen c6 is a step in the wrong direction because now I'm not hitting b2, and this pawn is no longer the liability it was a move ago. So instead, after queen c6, rook f4 was played, and he's getting some initiative with rook h4. And again, I just need to be calm and relax because rook h4 is not checkmate if I defend it. And I can defend it effectively by just playing queen d7. The point is now if rook h4, I just go f6, and my queen is defending horizontally, and I can build up the pressure on the e-file on this e3 pawn and start to slowly squeeze. But instead, I played the move rook e4 because I was so agitated, panicked by the idea of rook h4 that I wanted to stop it altogether. But the issue here is that now white has the opportunity to trade pieces in a position where he really was lacking space, and that really helps him a great deal. So bishop g2 is played, challenging my rook on e4, and now I have a little bit of a problem because if I move my rook away, then rook h4 is coming, and if I take, then I, make this e-pawn not backward and weak, and I help him, basically solve that weakness. So it actually turns out here, the best move still is actually just to go rook e7 back. And the point is that after bishop d5, queen d5, rook h4, again, I can just play f6. There's no checkmate on h7. And I can slowly improve and build up pressure on the e3 pawn, take space on the queen side. And I believe this position would be probably winning in the long run for black because it'd just be so difficult for white to defend this e3 pawn with, split rooks and a lack of coordination. It just seems to me like black would have the better of it. But instead, I was so panicked by this rook h4 maneuver that I traded. And this was a problem because now after bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, and e takes f4, we actually have a scenario where, essentially white does not have the same weaknesses he had before, and I have lost a great deal of my advantage. Now, I do want to back up for a moment because I did miss a variation, because after bishop takes d5, I actually thought for a moment here about rook f1 check as an intermediate move. And my idea with rook f1 check is that now this e3 pawn is still backward and kind of a weakness. But the point is actually after rook takes f1, queen takes d5, I was worried about rook f4 again and this rook swinging over to h4. It turns out even here, I can just play f6. And if queen h3, rook e8, and again, you can see the squeeze is on the e3 pawn, and it's sort of fixed as a weakness. So you can pretty much see on like 4 or 5 moves in a row, I had the scenario where I could defend the h7 pawn horizontally on the 7th rank as opposed to interposing on the 4th rank, and that kept the weakness on e3. So, yeah, kind of a missed opportunity. But instead, I got to this position, and I was thinking, all right, White definitely does not have the weak pawn on e1 anymore, but this queen on h6 is slightly misplaced and out of the game. And, of course, a rook now is not swinging over to the h-file. So even though he has this open file, I thought there may be some counterplay. I might have a moment of time here to try and put pressure on the white queen side. And so I did that. I started to do that by playing the move queen b5. And my idea here was to kind of provoke a crisis with these queenside pawns because b2 is not, easy to defend. So White now played rook e2, defending the b2 pawn, and I think that's logical. And now I thought, okay, of course, if this queen gets back into the game and gets consolidated, then White is the only one that could be better because of this pawn structure. So I have to do something now while the queen is off sides. And the best chance I thought I had was to play rook e8. And rook e8 is very counterintuitive because you might say, well, aren't you just trading pieces and White is getting closer to this endgame you talked about? Well, yes, White is getting closer to a pawn endgame, but I thought with this queen on h6 and my queen on e8, I might be able to wreak havoc in White's position and maybe win some of these pawns before White's queen got in the game. So that was my idea. So rook e5 was played. Very, very good and alert move. Note that if you play rook takes e8, queen takes e8, you're in huge trouble because queen e1 check is a serious threat and queen e3 check. So for instance, if queen h3 is played, trying to get the queen back, now I don't go queen e1 check because the queen could block. I instead go queen e3 check. And the point is, wherever the king goes, I'm going to pick off the pawn on b2 with check. So, for instance, let's say king g2, let's say queen e2 check, king g1, and then queen takes b2. And this position is actually just winning because I'm going to collect the c3 pawn, and my c pawn will be a runner. So, yeah, so there was some danger in this position, and very, very important move to stay in the game, rook e5, because now the rook is actually the one that's clogging up the file and not allowing me to get active there. Now, the downside to rook e5 is I do get to, take a pawn. So I went rook takes e5, and after f takes e5, I went queen takes b2. And all of a sudden, we have a very, very double-edged position where I'm actually a pawn up, but White has a somewhat dangerous passed d pawn because of the nature of my double pawns. So it's actually a very, very double-edged queen endgame where I have chances, but White with precise play should be able to hold. So anyways, White played queen g5. That's a good move, threatening queen d8 check and a perpetual. Note, queen d8, king g7, queen f6, and then checking on those squares. On those three squares should be the way to go. And so to try and fight and not make it a draw, I have to play queen b1 check. And after king g2, I went queen takes a2 check. And after king h3, I went queen e2. And this is actually, I'm actually 2 pawns up now, and it looks like White can get a perpetual with queen d8 and queen f6. And I was calculating here, and I wasn't quite sure what the evaluation of the position is, but I thought at the very least I have a draw. And so White plunged in with queen d8 check, and I went queen d7. And after queen f6 check, I went king h6, because if you take on f7 now, all of a sudden, this is actually lost because I have queen f1 check, king h4, and g5 mate all of a sudden. So that's very, very dangerous. And so after queen f6, king h6, now White has to check on h4. And here, it actually turns out I was calculating for a long time, and I wasn't really sure what the evaluation is, and I went king g7, and after queen f6 check, I went king h6 again, and queen h4. I thought for a while, actually a long while, I thought for like 30 minutes here, using up basically all my remaining time before move 40, and actually agreed to a draw here. But it actually turns out that in this position, queen h5 is actually winning. And the lines are actually so beautiful and study-like that I must show you these lines. So essentially, I saw that queen h5 gave me some chance. But basically, I rejected it because I thought after queen takes h5, g takes h5, that it was a draw. And I thought there was some risk for me. So first of all, well, I can't play king takes h5, right? Why is that? Well, because now after d5, my king is outside the square. So that after king h6, d6, king g7, d7, I'm not back in time. And note that I can't go via f6 because the pawn's in the way, and, well, white's too fast anyway. So king takes h5 doesn't work. So if queen h5, g takes h5 needs to be played. So now d5 is the move, right? Again, white is two pawns down here, but because I have these double pawns, I can't actually get a majority going on the f file. The key is to try and play with my outside pass pawn. And the thing is it seems like white is further ahead because this d pawn is further ahead than my b pawn. But look at this. After d5, I can go king g7. And now, if d6, now d6 is the move, I can play king f8. And after king h4, there's a very, very important move here. And it's actually amazing because what I was considering here was actually going for a5. And the reason this doesn't work is because after king g5, a4, king f6, king e8 now is forced, because if I go a3, now d7 is played, and after a3, d7, white queens and just wins, so I have to play king e8. Now d7 check is a move, and this is the move I was seeing all the time, is that after king takes d7, king takes f7, now white queens this pawn with tempo. So if I go a3, e6, check, king c7, note that I go king c7 so that he doesn't queen with check. e7, a2, queen e8, queen a1, or a1 queen. This is actually a draw because this queen can actually get can check me to death and get a perpetual, and at the very least take the pawn on c4. So this position I kind of evaluate as a draw, and I thought in time trouble where a lot of checks and my queen is misplaced, there's no way I can win this one. It's kind of ill-advised for me to go for it, especially with my pawns here being so weak. So I didn't want to go for that line. But it turns out I overlooked a very, very important detail. After d6, king f8, king h4, there's one move in this position that's winning. Why don't you pause the video and try to figure out what this move is? It's truly remarkable. And actually, if you find this move, there's actually a whole line connected to it. So you can, look at this position for 30 minutes and you probably won't find this line. Honestly, this is like a study-like position. All right, so the move in this position, the only winning move, remarkably, and it deserves multiple exclamation points, is actually h6. And this move is incredible for a few reasons, but the initial idea is that I'm actually stopping king g5. And so, obviously, if like d7, I can just go king e7 now and take the pawn, and so the pawn can't be pushed, and it gives me time to get my own pawn going. And the important thing is now white does get to eventually get to the g5 square and renew the threat of d7 and king f6, but he actually has to, take the h6 pawn to do it. So he takes two moves to get to g5 because he has to play king takes h5 and then king takes h6. And this valuable tempo is huge. So king takes h5, right? The only move that white can play. And now, amazingly, a5 is still not sufficient. The move here that wins, and again, this is amazing, is actually now the move b5. And the point is, now after king takes h6, there's another amazing move here. I go f4. Again, just crazy stuff. And the point is that after f4, you have to take this pawn because of f3. And after g takes f4, now b4. And the point is essentially that when I queen, I actually can take on f4 with check. And off f6 with check. So the issue is that after king g5, b takes c3, king f6. Again, now d7 is a threat like before. I have to go king e8, d7 check, king takes d7, king takes f7, c2 now. After e6, king c7, e7, c1 queen. White still queens with e8. But after e8 queen, queen takes f4, the point is I've actually got to f4 with check. I'm taking this pawn, and miraculously, this ending is actually winning because my queen is really well placed and the c pawn is so far advanced that it becomes a factor. And the issue is that this king can't go to the e file because if you go like king e7, I can actually go queen e4 check and actually just trade the queens. And you could see that in this type of position, I'm queening extremely quickly, and it's just losing for white. And if the king goes to the g file, which it needs to do after king g6, I don't take the pawn on h4, but I actually go queen d6 check. And again, white has a problem with his king where he can't go, he basically can't go to any reasonable square. If you go to h7, I have queen d7 check trading the queens, and again, my pawn is too far advanced and the endgame is winning. And if you go, so you really, the only way you can try to play this position is king f5, because at least with king f5, now queen d7 check doesn't work because white can trade queens and go king e4 and is actually now in the square. Note that now the king can take the c4 pawn, and now my king would have to run and get the h2 pawn. So after like king e7, or let's say I start with a5, king d4, e7, let's say a4, king takes d4, this would just be a draw. But the point is now, instead of playing queen d7 check after king f5, I can go c3, and the position is actually winning because my c pawn is now a major factor. c2 is a threat. And in this position, white actually has no checks because now the king is outside the square. And if you go for a move like queen f7 check, now I can go queen d7 and just trade queens. And so you can't actually deliver any checks. And if you try to go king e4, trying to come closer to this pawn, now again I just go c2. And again, the king is outside the square once again, but can't come closer, and c1 is a major, major threat. So miraculously, this position is actually winning, and yeah, that line was just totally fascinating to me. I'm going to back up just a little bit once more, just so you can see the whole line in its entirety and see the win that I missed, and you be the judge of whether or not that should have been found, or whether I should have gone for the line. So after queen h4, queen h5, takes, d5, king g7, d6, king f8, king h4, h6, only winning move. King takes h5, f4, b5, king takes h6, f4, amazing, amazing move. G takes f4, b4, king g5, takes, king f6, king e8, stopping d7, d7 anyway, takes, c2, e7, e6, king c7, e7, queen, c1 queen, e8 queen, queen takes f4, king f4, king f6, king f7, king f8, king f7, king f6, king f7, king f8, king f7, king f7, king f8, king f7, 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 king king g6, queen d6 check, very important check, king f5, and then c3 winning. So that line was maybe like 10 moves or so, and I tried to work out these details, but quite frankly, I did not see the breakthrough with f4, and that's actually the whole key to the position is h6 and then f4, and those two pawn moves are so amazingly study-like. It would have been it would have been really something if I won this game, just from an aesthetic point of view, and I'm a bit disappointed I didn't see it, but it is what it is. So anyway, I drew down against 2100, not necessarily what you want to do, but it's not a loss, and I was hoping to recover in another round. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel, and if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.